Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to return to the Roosevelt Presidential Library. I think this is my 26th visit here to Hyde Park. And while I'm going to talk primarily about Eisenhower today, let me say a few words about FDR and Ike. They met formally and briefly, very briefly, when Eisenhower was sent to London in June of 1942, just a very pro forma session in the White House. Later, on his way to Tehran in 43, at the end of 43, the president stopped off in North Africa and spent 2 full days with Eisenhower. FDR was taking Ike's measure, and he liked what he saw. The two were very much alike. They bonded, really, on a motor trip to see the battlefield at Carthage. And Roosevelt was also smitten with Kay Summersby and insisted that Kay sit next to him at a picnic lunch they had on the way. Immediately after the Tehran conference, Roosevelt picked Eisenhower to command the D-Day invasion. The job was General Marshal's if he wanted it, but with characteristic self-discipline, Marshall declined to express an opinion when Roosevelt asked him. And at that point, FDR said simply, "It will be Eisenhower." Eisenhower was Roosevelt's first choice, really, to command the D-Day invasion. By that point, he had 3 major amphibious operations under his belt. He was experienced leading coalition forces. The old story that Roosevelt could not sleep with Marshall out of Washington was spin that was put on it in order to save Marshall's face by not getting the command position. Ike and Roosevelt met once more in January 1944 when Eisenhower visited Washington. They thought alike. They got along marvelously, except on the question of Charles de Gaulle. Roosevelt hated de Gaulle. Eisenhower knew that de Gaulle was essential and, in fact, outmaneuvered the president, which very few people have ever done. Now, my text for today's lecture on Eisenhower is a letter that Ike wrote to his brother Edgar when Ike was president in 1955. Edgar was one of his older brothers. It said, "Ike, should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security and eliminate labor laws, you would never hear of that party again. There is a tiny splinter group that believes you can do these things, but their number is negligible, and they are stupid." Eisenhower was a progressive conservative. On fiscal matters, he was militantly conservative. He insisted on a balanced budget, resisted deficit spending, and refused to cut taxes until the government's expenditures were in line with its revenue. But he also recognized that government had a positive role to play. When the economy turned down after the Korean War, Eisenhower launched the Interstate Highway program, which is really the mother of all stimulus programs. The total cost of the Interstate program exceeded the total expenditures of the New Deal from 1933 to 1941. And the entire program was funded without impacting the federal budget, simply by increasing the tax on gasoline. Eisenhower also constructed the St Lawrence Seaway, a mammoth public works project opening the Midwest to open traffic. He expanded the Social Security system, adding 12 million self-employed persons, doctors, lawyers, accountants, and so forth, to the Social Security rolls. He increased benefits across the board and raised the minimum wage by 25%. And perhaps above all, Eisenhower took on Senator McCarthy and soundly defeated the Wisconsin senator, restoring the nation's sanity after almost a decade of anti-communist hysteria. Eisenhower orchestrated the Army's response during the Army-McCarthy hearings, and at a crucial point during those hearings, issued one of the most far-reaching executive orders ever issued, prohibiting government employees from testifying before Congress. But he handled the entire matter behind the scenes, never showed his hand, never exposed himself. "I'm not going to get into a pissing contest with that skunk," Ike told his brother Milton. He did it all behind the scenes. Eisenhower's appointments to the federal judiciary led the way to social equality, racial equality in the United States. And it was not just the appointments of Earl Warren and William Brennan to the Supreme Court, but the host of liberal Republican judges that Roosevelt appointed in the South. Men like Elbert Tuttle of Georgia and John Minor Wisdom of Louisiana. These were the judges who were in the vanguard of the civil rights struggle. But the most significant judicial appointment, I think, that Eisenhower made at that time was that of John Marshall Harlan, the great conservative justice, just after the court's landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education. Shortly after that decision came down, Justice Robert Jackson died, leaving a vacancy on the court. And at that point, Roosevelt turned to Harlan, who was the grandson of the great John Marshall Harlan, who had been the only dissenter in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the case that legalized segregation. By appointing Harlan, the namesake of the great dissenter, Eisenhower was making a statement that the South could not ignore. Desegregation was the law of the land, and Eisenhower was going to enforce it. When a mob of segregationists attempted to block the integration of Central High and Little Rock, Eisenhower sent the regular army, not just the regular army, but the 101st Airborne, to Little Rock to enforce the court's order. Eisenhower's view on desegregation was clear. He recognized that this was a bitter pill for the South to swallow, and so he placed the emphasis on the fact that this was law, that the Supreme Court decisions was the law of the land, and Eisenhower was going to enforce it. Ike believed it would be easier for the South to accept desegregation if he stressed it was the law of the land. His successors, LBJ and JFK, emphasized the virtue of integration. Ike stressed the rule of law. And if you look back to 1950 and the early 50s, this might have been the most effective strategy. In foreign policy, Eisenhower's record is exemplary. After the election in 1952, before taking office, he went to Korea, flew in an Army spotter plane, a little Piper Cub, along the entire battle line, and concluded the war was unwinnable. Over the objections of the commanders on the spot, South Korean President Syngman Rhee, John Foster Dulles, and a significant portion of the Republican Party, Eisenhower made peace. And after he did so, early in his term, not one American serviceman was killed in action for the remaining 8 years of Eisenhower's presidency. For Eisenhower, the phrase limited war was a contradiction in terms. Like America's other great military president, Ulysses Grant, Eisenhower hated war and firmly insisted that the United States would not become involved in conflict unless national survival was at stake. Not national security, but national survival. Eisenhower, by the way, had no national security advisor. Ike was his own national security advisor. He had a secretary to the National Security Council, but no national security advisor. That came in with President Kennedy in 1961. And the country trusted Eisenhower's judgment completely. As president, Ike slashed defense spending, reduced U.S. ground forces, and introduced what we call the new look to military strategy. the United States would